Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, does Viz bioaccumulate? In early versions of Ars Magica, the pawn of Viz was a quantum. You either had a pawn, or you did not. There were no fractions of a pawn of Viz. I can't recall how early this was broken, but I certainly recall a Viz source being given which was a cave of bats, with one pawn of Viz for every 100 pairs of bat wings. As you collected them, you had something you couldn't use. This meant that, in a game sense, the pawn quantum was maintained, but in a world-building sense, it meant that pawns were divisible into smaller units, which the Order could identify magically but not use. This eventually culminated in the spark magic of the Socotrans, which has a usable amount of 1/10 of the hermetic pawn, but it recognises that even tiny amounts of Viz have flickers of power in them, which can be bundled together for use or eaten by magical creatures. Eating Viz has often been presented as a good idea. To make Viz sources useful to classes of character other than Magi, many of the early ones had magical effects, so they were consumed as single-use magic items. A typical example was a tree of apples that contained corpus Viz, but if eaten would heal wounds permanently. This didn't formally create warping, those many years ago, but something like warping occurred in the colour text, and so eating too much Viz was probably not good for a single person. If the bats are somehow concentrating Viz out of the world's aura, then what happens to it if they die but are not collected by magicians? You might make an argument that the bats need to be collected alive. A parallel case might be made that a magical fire needs to be collected before it goes out. In this case, Viz cannot bioaccumulate because death makes the subtle connections between the magical energy and the physical material decay. A counter-argument might be that things only need to be collected while they resonate with the form. A fire that goes out is no longer a fire, but a bat that is killed and dried is, one might argue, still a bat. As such, the form may be maintained and the Viz retained. If the Viz remains in the dead object, then can it accumulate through biological processes? If, for example, the dead bats pile up on the floor of the cave, can a magus collect them before they rot? If they're something a bit more durable, could there be a vast hoard of Viz? I'd argue that the vast hoards of Viz are eaten by fairies, which explains why they're so rarely found. A cache of this type is, however, suitable as a starting point for a covenant. If the object is destroyed outside the laboratory, can the form be maintained? You might argue that dissolution within the form may not cause harm, so if I have Viz-enriched wine in a glass and pour it into a barrel of wine, there seems a stronger argument that a magus could then extract that again, for example, than if I mix the wine into a bucket of clay. Now, might a similar argument be made for trophic biomagnification? As a snake is animal, does it suffice to retain the Viz of the dying bat? Is there a loss in this process, or can it gather all the Viz? If a kingfisher then starts eating these snakes, does it, in turn, bioaccumulate Viz? Is there a loss at each level? And do the Magi care if it means they don't need to wade into guano to collect rotting bat corpses? This might be a way of introducing the hooks which provide the Covenant with surprising resources. The player characters discover that their Viz source is an accumulation from a lower trophic level, and they can get more by tracing back the creatures they have been harvesting to their feeding grounds.